Welcome. This is chapter 15, part 1. We're going to talk about the music of Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven. Now, Beethoven is probably one of the most important composers that we're going to talk about in this class. And, well, why was he important? And he's important because he's extremely influential. He's influential to the composers that follow him. Okay. In addition, he's writing some awesome music and some really kind of defining music. A lot of his music really kind of defines what the classical period is about. Okay. Now, time frame, he was born in 1770 and he dies in 1827. And he's born kind of at the right time where he's towards the end of the classical period, and Beethoven is extremely important into taking us from the classical period music and launching us right into the Romantic period. Okay. Now, his music is, definitely is most of the music is considered classical music. Towards the mid to late part of his life, we start to see a lot of romantic elements coming into his music. Okay. His lifestyle, his career, shall I say, is divided into three parts. The early career, where he's modeling a lot of his works after Haydn and Mozart, and they're really, kind of classically driven, especially with the genres like string quartets, his early piano sonatas. And then we have the middle period. They often call it the heroic period. Okay, and that's where we're going to get symphonies like his Fifth Symphony and Eroica. And then finally we had the late period. And the late period, by that time he's completely deaf, and he's writing kind of music that he wants to hear himself. And so we hear the music like the late string quartets, the Grosse Fuge, and of course the Ninth Symphony. So obviously the classical period, he uses and expands a lot of classical forms and genres. He's a master at using, sonata allegro form. He's a master at writing this, the symphony and the string quartet. And he's not only just a master of it, he takes these genres, like he takes a symphony, and he writes much larger symphonies than Mozart and Haydn. He switches out movements. Instead of having that third movement, which is a minuet, well, now he has a scherzo, which is a very, very kind of a minuet in steroids. It's a very, very fast dance movement. He'll add funeral marches to his symphonies. So he'll switch up the norm and the expectation. With the romantic influences, well, first off, one of the main things that Beethoven, he starts to go deaf gradually throughout his life. Around 1800, 1801, he starts to get a light buzzing in his ear, and then by 1815, 1816, he's almost completely deaf. And it's very, very impactful for his life. And he goes from being the premier pianist in the Vienna in the 1800s to he stops performing and starts writing exclusively. And that has a pivotal impact on his music. Another idea that we comes out of Beethoven's life is the artist as a genius, or even as an unfettered genius. And lots of people look at Beethoven in his life like this artist who's writing this music that, we're not on his level to comprehend music that he's creating. And then, of course, the final thing is dramatic power. And we see dramatic power all throughout his life. Definitely with his piano sounds like the Pathétique, and his dramatic, intense tremolos, and his crashing dissonant chords, to the dramatic power of the Fifth Symphony. Like the intensity of that first movement. We see dramatic power definitely in his late string quartets, and then we also see it in the Ninth Symphony, definitely with the culmination of the choral movement. So that's a good overview of what to expect with Beethoven. So we have the turbulent years, the age of the revolution. And we have to take a look at this. If we see here on the slide, it says 1789. And that's 1789. That's when we have the French Revolution. We have the storming of the Bastille. People having all these uprisings in France, and it's the middle and lower classes uprising against the wealthy or the upper class because of extreme poverty and so forth with the lower classes. And we see a lot of kind of exuberant wealth with the upper class, and they're not letting it trickle down. And then henceforth we have a lot of revolution, we have the guillotine, a lot of beheadings, and a lot of, again, turbulent years. And it comes out as a specific time. And if we look at below, we have three classical composers. We have Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, most important composers of the classical period. And we look at their timeline and their lifespan. And when you look at this, you look at Haydn. Well, Haydn was born, he's born almost 50 years before that. He's 1732. Let's say by the 1750s, he's in his mid-20s, and he's being kind of established as a composer. And he really is unaffected by political events. He spends most of his time working with the Esterházy family, a good 30 years of his life. And he's writing symphonies, he's writing string quartets, piano sonatas. He's establishing what we now know as we consider the classical style. Okay. Now we have Mozart. Mozart, he's born later on, a lot closer to this idea of revolution, and he only dies 2 years after the French Revolution. And yes, he does have some poignant pieces that kind of push the boundaries or make political commentary on the upper classes, especially with his operas, with Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. But he's still, he's not coming into with us where he gets really affected by revolution, or his music is not really kind of pushing the boundaries with regards to revolution. Beethoven comes at a time where he's definitely very, very impacted with his revolution. Okay, mind you, the French Revolution is extremely impactful in Europe because it's basically the aristocracy is getting destroyed, and we're getting a democracy back into France. And then keep in mind, after that in the 1790s, we have Napoleon coming to power, and then we have the Neapolitan Wars going all throughout the 1790s up to 1813, 1814, to his defeat at Waterloo. And this is the time where Beethoven's active as a composer. He's active as a composer. He's a staple in Vienna by the 1800s. And he's definitely very, very impacted by Napoleon and the ongoings of French Revolution. Okay, Beethoven's more of a humanitarian. He wants to have the people have a voice. He's not very interested in the aristocracy, the elite wealthy class. He's only interested in them when he can get money or when he can get commissions. But Beethoven's interested in writing music for himself. And look, if he could finagle these guys to give money, he'll sign their name and dedicate pieces to them. But Beethoven's interested in having the common man or the everyday man be kind of in governing themselves. And we see this humanitarian theme in a lot of his works, and definitely in works like the Choral Symphony. Okay, the early years. So the early years we look at 1770 to 1802. And we talk about his early life. Well, Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany. Okay, small town, kind of on the out. It's not a very, very big metropolis like Vienna. He's born into a family of musicians. His father and grandfather are both performers at the court in Germany, at Bonn, Germany, and Beethoven. He learns the family crafts. Now, keep in mind though that his father was an abusive alcoholic. And there are so many stories of him. His father would come home hammered drunk. He'd wake his son up and pull him out of bed and make him practice and play at all hours of night. There's stories of father beating Beethoven, hitting his head, and one of the theories back in like the 1950s was that since his father was an abusive alcoholic and beat Beethoven, that was one of the reasons that's why he went deaf, because of getting hit. I don't think the theory holds water, but that was one of the theories. Now, we do see things like, Beethoven made him, his father made him practice. His father did try and have Beethoven. He was a prominent young musician. He was a very, very talented pianist, even at an early age, he learned pieces like Bach's Waltz Tempo Clavier, which is a challenging piece. And his father would have him perform for locals and so forth. And his father would lie about his age. If Beethoven was 13, maybe the father would say, "Oh, he's only 9 or 10." Just what the idea was, the father tried to make Beethoven appear like the next Mozart. So again, not his father wasn't a great guy. Definitely kind of abusive alcoholic, and it wasn't. Beethoven didn't have a very happy childhood, not at all. He definitely had brothers and so forth that he supported, and he did make sure that his father does pass away eventually, and Beethoven befriends Haydn. Haydn actually stops through Bonn one day, and Beethoven meets him and performs for him, and Haydn takes Beethoven on as a student. And Haydn says, "Listen, come to Vienna, and I'll introduce you to everybody and the aristocracy and so forth." So eventually, Beethoven gets to move to Vienna, and he goes there twice. 1787, he goes with Haydn. He does have to go back to Bonn for a little bit. I believe because his mother passes away. And then by the time 1792 rolls around, Beethoven's in Vienna, and he stays in Vienna permanently. Okay. Again, remember, Vienna is the capital for art and music at this time in the classical period. So Haydn lived in Vienna and worked in Vienna. Mozart lived in Vienna in the later part of his years, and Beethoven spends most of his time in Vienna. Okay. So studying with Haydn did have its attributes, though. Haydn, he introduced him to all the wealthy aristocrats, and Beethoven got entry into the houses of the wealthy. He got to play all these piano pieces. Beethoven he was wonderful at improvisation. And so lots of times people would give Beethoven a melody and say, "Hey, can you improvise on it?" And Beethoven would create like an hour-long piece or maybe a half-hour-long piece on just one theme. And it was really, really, he was really masterful at playing the piano and at improvising as well. So definitely, he definitely got the ear of many, many wealthy patrons. Now, as far as we talk about his playing, well, he definitely played louder and more forcefully, and more violently than any Viennese pianist heard. And his music was, there were stories of him playing on the piano and breaking strings lots of times and so forth. And a couple things. You have to keep in mind, pianos back in the 1800s, they maybe had wood frames, they didn't have metal strings, and they were not nearly as durable as the modern pianos we know of today. So definitely, it was definitely possible to break strings and so forth, and I'm sure some of these stories are true. Beethoven wanted the piano to be stronger and more fuller than it was. And we'll see later on that people actually kind of reinvent the piano for standards that Beethoven would want, and we'll talk about that in a slide or two. So, again, he's playing for his wealthy patrons. He gains their support, and he definitely, by the 1800s, is probably one of the most famous and important pianists in Vienna. Beethoven and the piano. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Beethoven would be playing on some of these pianos, and they'd either break strings or they were not nearly as durable. And if you look at the piano evolved with Beethoven, is it the chicken or the egg? Well, who knows? The piano definitely needed to be more larger and be able to sustain, have more power to it. Beethoven demanded this in his piano music. Okay, so if you look on the slide on the left, we see a traditional piano of the classical period. It's 5 octaves. Okay, it may be 170, 200 pounds. It's very similar to a harpsichord. You only have the double strings in the piano. Whereas later on in Beethoven's life, we see the piano on the right. And we'll start to see, 6 octaves, so that the span of the keyboard is getting larger, okay? And you have each piano string has 3 strings now, okay? And we start to see metal sounding boards in the piano as well. And that's important because you can have more tension with the strings, and that metal resonance really, really helps build the sound of the piano. So again, and all this evolution with the piano is happening during his life. Okay, people actually there are piano makers who actually made pianos especially for Beethoven. Give it to him as a gift and so forth. It happens through his life. So again, Beethoven's very, very important for the evolution of the piano, and his piano music is extremely important too as well. Just to echo on that. So he wrote 32 piano sonatas. These piano sonatas are a staple today. Like if you go to study at a conservatory, if you study piano at a college university, well, your entrance exam, you have to be able to play one of these Beethoven sonatas. His piano concertos is another piece that they get performed all the time throughout the world because they're kind of the canon of classical music repertoire, and Beethoven had a large say in what was appropriate classical music. Continuing talking about piano music. So the piece we're going to look at by Beethoven, it's a piece for solo piano, and it's going to be a piano sonata. And his piano sonata, Opus 13, is called the Pathétique. Okay, we're going to look at just the first movement. It's an intense piece. It's in 3 different movements. And a piano sonata, just like a symphony, it's a multi-movement piece. Okay, but with a piano sonata, it's going to be 3 or 4 movements played exclusively for the piano. You can have sonatas just for the piano. You can also have instrumental sonatas like a violin sonata or a cello sonata, which Beethoven wrote. And that would be a violin with a piano accompaniment. Or if it was a cello sonata, it would be a cello and piano accompaniment. This piece is just for solo piano. The word pathétique, that was a term that Beethoven put to this piano sonata. And it kind of means passion or pathos. Okay. And we're going to see with this piece, there's definitely this passion and intensity, especially with the first movement. There's this kind of dramatic tension between loud and soft sections. There's intensity with kind of very fast and slow sections. Okay, so I think the word pathétique kind of really fits this piece. The piece is more virtuosic than earlier pieces. Okay. It definitely the sonata allegro form really controls this intensity. And as I said, we're going to see an extreme range of dynamics and tempo. An example of this is the opening introduction. It's very, very loud chords juxtaposed by very, very soft chords. And it's that juxtaposition that's kind of really intense. The same thing, and with the tempos, we have a very, very slow introduction that's contrasted by a very, very fast sonata allegro section. So we see this kind of juxtaposition, which really kind of adds to this passion. So Beethoven frequently played this piece in aristocratic homes. And this piece was it was a home run as soon as he wrote it. People loved to hear him play it, and whatnot. So it was a famous piece. As soon as it got published, people were playing it all throughout, and it's a piece that's played today as well. So the first movement, it starts out with an introduction, and keep in mind with sonata allegro form, we're going to have those 3 parts. We're going to have the exposition, the development, the recapitulation, and the introduction is optional. Definitely, you can have it. You don't have to have it. Beethoven chose to add it for this time. And the introduction for this one is the tempo is very, very slow. Okay. And so we see this basically, it starts off with this kind of dramatic chord, and then it has a very, very kind of a few chords afterwards. They're very, very soft. And then we have a dramatic chord again, and then afterwards we have a couple very, very soft chords. And it's going to go from loud to soft to loud to soft. Let's listen. So we make it through the introduction, and we go through all these intense dramatic chords, these very soft chords. We have a very lyrical section, going back to some softer chords again, and we have this big descending chromatic line that sets us up for this exposition. Now the tempo is really, really fast. The tempo marking is allegro di molto cambrio. That means fast, very, very fast, and with bright brilliance. And we'll hear tremolos in the left hand that kind of builds this intensity, and this melodic line in the right hand with these chords going all the way up and then come crashing down again. Let's go listen, and we're going to listen for the intensity. So continuing to the second theme. The second theme, it's great. It's in the key of E flat minor. Okay, and what we'll see is, if you were to watch this playing performed live, the pianist is going to reach over with his right hand and play the second theme in the bass with his right hand, while he's playing an accompaniment with his left hand. And you're going to see this kind of cross-hand piano playing, which kind of adds to the show. In addition, since he's going back from the bass into the treble with his right hand, you have a call and response with this melody for the second theme. Let's go listen to that when I play the example. This is going to be the second theme of the exposition. Now, when we come to the closing theme, we'll hear, the left and right hands playing, and they're kind of going in opposite direction, really kind of fanning out and utilizing the entire space of the keyboard. And it kind of really brings this exposition to a close. Let's go listen to this. So we wrap up the exposition. We go in the development section. With the development section, Beethoven references that slow introduction again, because it's that juxtaposition between tempos. So we have that slow introduction briefly, and then we have the development section where he's going to develop a lot of the material from the exposition. The material is going to be in the left hand a little bit, with the right hand doing tremolos. When we get to the recapitulation, he's going to reintroduce both of the first and second themes, but they're all going to be in the key of C minor. And then when we get to that closing section, he's going to reference the introduction one more time, and he's going to have a coda for it at the end to really kind of wrap up this piece. So when we go through and listen to the entire first movement, try and make sure you're identifying, what sections the exposition, what sections the development section, the recapitulation, and then look out for the major themes for the piece. And I hope you enjoy it. It's a great piece. It's passionate. It's energetic, and definitely it's a great piano sonata. So this concludes Chapter 15, Part 1, talking about the music of Beethoven. Continue to Chapter 15, Part 2, and we're going to continue talking about the music of Beethoven, and we're going to look at his Fifth Symphony.